one of the most challenging questions I get is actually why even make an album in the first place? It's almost like an existential crisis, right? So if you read any major media outlet like the New York Times or like a music outlet like Rolling Stone or Pitchfork, they all triumphantly declare that the album as an art form is dead. The music industry is all about singles and instant music, and people hear it once and they forget about it. So it's a whole disposable music culture. And for me as an artist, I completely, absolutely disagree with that statement 100%. So for me, I view albums as a special opportunity to actually create an artistic statement. And that's absolutely what I'm trying to do with this album of Sand and Stars. So what I'm trying to do is I have this whole background story, which I'll read to you later, and all of the music is trying to convey the themes and ideas and elements of that story, and this is famously done in probably my favorite piece of classical music of all time, which is Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade. And so in that piece of classical music, you have different characters that are represented by different instruments. Scheherazade by the violin, the Sultan by the bass, and all these motifs are propagated throughout the whole symphony. And that's kind of how I fell in love with this whole concept of creating music that conveys these stories. And so without further ado, I'm sure you guys are probably interested in what the actual story is behind Of Sand and Stars. And so I actually have that written down, and I'm going I'm going to try to read as much as possible off of this. That way I don't when I tell stories, I get off track really easily. I try to elaborate, and I'm going to try to keep it as focused as possible for you guys. But a little bit of story behind the story is actually this story came to me in a dream 4 years ago when I was studying abroad in England, and I remember waking up at 3 in the morning, and just like being compelled. I was like, I have to write this story down. It was just so nuts that I was like, oh, if I don't write this down, I will regret it forever. And so I'm gonna tell the story to you, and I'm gonna tell it to you in terms of how the songs and the album are portrayed in the story. So the first song on the album is our introduction, and it's titled "The Shadow Teller." And so this it was part of my dream, but the lyrics for this song are actually a poem I wrote 12 years ago, half a lifetime for me. So in Intro to the Shadow Teller, we're introduced to this world that has descended to chaos. And the whole world is on the brink of collapse. We're introduced to this character, the Shadow Teller, who warns us that the apocalypse will basically descend on the whole world if we don't change course and change our ways and become better people. But unfortunately, all these warnings fall into deaf ears, and we don't, as a civilization, we don't make the changes we need to do to become healthy and sustainable, and basically the world ends in chaos. So that's kind of like the world that we enter with this story. And so in the second track on the album, we're introduced. It's called Monoliths of Stone. We're introduced to our protagonist. So the story represents the journey of this man named Montag, and so Montag, he's the only survivor of this apocalypse, and in that song Monoliths of Stone, he's walking through the wreckage of this abandoned hulk of a city. So he remembers when this city was once alive and full of energy, and of course like it contrasts with the reality that he sees. So actually it's sometimes painful for him to remember what happened during that apocalypse, and seeing the images of the city burning. And so he's been alone for such a long time. He essentially gets to his wit's end, and at the end of the track, he tries to commit suicide by jumping into the ocean. But he kind of just ends up drifting away, which leads us into the next song, Suspended Animation. So this scene in the story is Montag just jumped into the ocean. It's freezing cold, and so he floats aimlessly, but he basically enters this trance-like state where his perception of reality fades away, and he's barely conscious, and so essentially he's just questioning, there's just like things like the meaning of life, and in the monologue I tell him this in the actual album itself, you hear a little bit of his inner thoughts, as he's just floating. So the scene ends basically, he's just sinking to the bottom of the ocean, and in the next track, Unplanned Resurrection, we see actually this whole alien spaceship come and pick up his body from the ocean. They bring him aboard the ship, and that song Unplanned Resurrection. So by that point, Montag is dead. He's just a frozen, cold corpse, and so these aliens, for a reason that will be revealed later, they try to bring him back to life. And so for now we're like, oh, okay, these guys are really good guys. So they save the last man alive on Earth, and they take him aboard their vessel, and of course, Montag, he reawakens once he has been brought back to life, and he finds himself aboard this huge, vast spaceship, and awaiting him at the basically like where he was brought back to life in the hospital bed is a human woman. So this woman, who's named Elizabeth, she also survived the apocalypse, but was actually abducted by the aliens several years prior. So she knows her way around the ship very well, and she can actually communicate. So like the ship's run by this AI, and so she can communicate with it. And the first time Montag sees it, he's just like, "Wow, that's the craziest thing I've ever seen." Talking to a ship, and they walk around this ship and they see like treasures from all over the universe, and because that's the goal of the ship itself. It's a research vessel trying to study the universe and find amazing things. So of course, Montag, being the last man who was alive on Earth, and finding another human woman, of course they're gonna fall in love. That just has to happen. And so we see that in this track, Interstellar Voyage. And so Montag and Elizabeth, they go and they journey outside of the starship, and they travel through star fields, and there's comets whizzing by them, and they go explore planets together, and of course fall in love with each other. But since this is a dystopian novel, nothing good can last. And of course this whole love scene ends with this menacing aura approaching, and that leads us into the harvest. And essentially, I told you that the ship was run by this AI computer, but that's actually turns out to not be the case. The ship ends up being run by this hive mind of brains from all over the galaxy that just like live in these jars. And so the aliens who brought Montag back to life, they come and they drag Elizabeth away, and Montag sees the whole thing, and unfortunately they kill her, and then they harvest her brain to become part of that collective intelligence. And so after seeing all this happen, Montag is actually thrown into a prison cell aboard the ship, and so we hear a little bit of his pain in the song "Look at Me Sorrow," the things that he's like emotionally experiencing. So he's really tormented by what he saw. So he knows that he's going to be the next one to be killed. And there's no hope of him escaping that prison cell that he was just put into. But midway through this song, actually, so Elizabeth, she becomes part of the ship's intelligence, and so she actually comes to visit Montag as a hologram, and so she's brought back to life as a hologram, and so she explains to him that she's kind of holding off this mental onslaught from the other brains, and so she, because she's in love with him, she wants to help him escape, that this life aboard, a floating prison essentially. Shouldn't be his fate. He's escaped death twice, and he really he has to live his life. And so she helps him to escape the prison cell, and as a hologram she guides him to find weapons to fight off the aliens. And the song ends of him just like fighting his way across the ship, trying to find a way of escaping. which leads us actually to the conclusion of the story and conclusion of the album, which is Epilogue Return to Earth. And in this song, in the scene, in the story, Montag finds his way to an escape pod. He slams the doors shut and starts the startup procedure to get off the ship. And so Elizabeth is helping him this whole time. And so because she's part of that intelligence, she's able to actually control the ship so that it can authorize permission for the escape pod to blast off. And so this whole time the aliens are shooting and trying to get into the escape pod and trying to get them out. And so as one final act of goodwill, Elizabeth helps him to blast off from the ship, like I mentioned earlier. But of course, she can't go with him. She's part of the intelligence permanently. So they say their final goodbye. And so he's just in this escape pod floating through space. And then he ends up actually making it back to Earth. And upon his final approach, he hears he radios in and he hears people responding. And it turns out that there were more survivors on Earth. And so luckily they got him back safely to the surface. He lands in the ocean with a huge splash, and the whole story ends with Montag, back on Earth, emerging from this escape pod, just standing in the middle of the vast ocean, kind of back where he began, but with a new outlook on life. That's the story of the album. I really hope that you enjoyed it, and I hope that inspires you to actually take a deeper listen into the music itself.